Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here to History Live tonight. I'm Lana Costantini, Deputy Director of San Francisco Historical Society. I'd also like to welcome all the people who are joining us from home online. I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the events that bring us here this evening. Early in 2024, I read a news article by Julie Zagoras in the San Francisco Standard about an amazing collection of never-before-seen photographs documenting the destruction of the Fillmore district as part of the federally funded urban renewal project of the 1950s through the 1970s. The photographs were taken in 1960 and 1961 by San Francisco architect Ernie Burden Jr. and his wife, Sheila Stover. The archive consisted of more than 4,000 negatives, documenting the annihilation of this vibrant neighborhood in heartbreaking detail. The archive wasn't shared with the world until 2023, when Ernie's son, Ernest Burden III, who was with us tonight, Ernie, raise your hand. When he chose to make the collection of negatives public in the San Francisco Standard. Ernest had promised his father before he died that the photographs would be shown in San Francisco and that ultimately he'd find a place for them in a San Francisco museum. After reading the article, I immediately reached out to Ernest. I thought there might be a way for the Historical Society to collaborate with him in an effort to share the archive, and that maybe our publication, The Argonaut, could be a good medium for sharing his parents' powerful photos. Publishing the photos would be powerful for sure, but it wouldn't be enough. The voices were missing. So we sought out the stories, memoirs, and commentary of those who were there and shared their perspectives in and among the photos. The result of this collaboration is the special edition of The Argonaut, which was published in late 2024. Many of you have a copy already. If you're a member, you certainly should. If you would like to purchase one, copies are available in the lobby. So we're here tonight to gain a deeper understanding of what happened in the Western Addition as a result of urban renewal by hearing directly from those who were there or from those who know a lot about it through their research and study. And our panelists are made up of that group of people. We're also creating an upcoming exhibit that feature the actual photographs, printed photographs from the Burden archive, many of which did not appear in the Argonaut. That exhibit will open on Thursday, July 10th for members, special preview, and open to the public on July 19th. Now, I'd like to invite Todd Mayberry, our Executive Director, to introduce our panelists and our moderator. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I just want to say thank you for coming out tonight. This is going to be a powerful discussion, and I very much look forward to hearing from the voices of our panelists this evening. I also want to say thanks to everyone that's attending online. I know there's many of you out there. I greatly appreciate your joining us this evening. And for everyone that's made a donation, thank you. Your support makes programming like this possible. It's critical to being able to, excuse me, have our History Live program, which is our monthly program and series. You have to check out this exhibit that we're doing, opening again to the public on the 19th, and our preview is on Thursday, so just right around the corner. A lot of great things are happening here at the Historical Society, and it's because of you and your support in being here. And as Lana mentioned, I'm going to introduce our panelists this evening, and just a very short little intro here. In no particular order, however, maybe you could raise your hand as I call you out. We have Gary Kamiya, who is joining us this evening. He's a journalist and historian, and as we all know, I think, author of Cold Gray City of Love, and many other writings about San Francisco. Gary will also be available for signing and selling books after the presentation, just right around the corner there, everybody. We also have Noah Griffin, who is a former San Francisco Historical Society board member, long supporter of our organization and being a board member for quite some years. He's also an San Francisco native, a media personality and a writer, according to your byline in your the Argonaut article that you gave us as a gift. And also we have Ernest Burden. Lana called out, and Ernest, I know you are very sleep deprived coming all the way from the East Coast today on your very long journey to join us. Thank you for being here. Ernest is behind, along with his partner, the Burden Archive, and again, those photographs that we're seeing are going to be, well, are part of our Argonaut and part of our upcoming exhibit. Incredibly powerful work. Maddie Scott is here as well, who I have to say wins the award for the best shoes in the house. Maddie is a community activist, a longtime resident of the Western Addition, and president of Freedom West Housing Corporation. And then finally, this evening, our moderator is Kevin Pursglove, who is a former San Francisco Historical Society president and current board member. He's also was the eBay corporate spokesman, former producer and program host of KQED Radio Forum, and former press secretary to Mayor Susan Hammer of San Jose. Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we'll do a little deeper dive and get to know all of our panelists and their stories.
Todd, thank you very much. Lana, thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you all for showing up for tonight's discussion. Very quickly, I just want to get an idea as a starting point. How many of you have had a chance to go through the Argonaut Journal that is the basis for this program tonight? So a good turnout, I'd say, good 10 or 12 hands were raised there for people who've already read the articles and seen the pictures here. And how many of you, again, a simple show of hands, have direct experiences, either yourselves or your family, from the Western Addition, the Fillmore area? Now that's interesting. Even larger show of hands of people who were directly living or had some type of association with that area. So we'll be very interested to hear some of your comments later. Just one more reminder, when we get around to doing the Q&A with you, wait until we bring the microphone to you. And also, as you formulate your questions or your comments, please try to make them short and brief so that we can keep the conversation going lively here. Gary, you are probably have written more on urban renewal in San Francisco's Western Addition than anybody else that I can think of. So paint a picture for us. Where were we back in the the early 70s, in the late 60s, I guess it was, when urban renewal first took really hold across the country, generated primarily out of Washington, D.C.?
If we were in a fraught time in the United States with federal monies becoming available to rehabilitate so-called blighted areas. But before I talk specifically about that element, I'd like to go back sort of to the beginning of the Western Addition. Its history is so rich and fascinating that I'll just like to give a very brief sort of précis of this really remarkable, maybe one of the most remarkable of San Francisco neighborhoods. It's been through no fewer than 3 cataclysmic changes. Probably the only neighborhood I can think of in San Francisco that could match that is South Park, much smaller and less important. So during the early gold rush, this was an unsettled area outside the city limits, filled with farms. By the 1870s, however, it had become a streetcar suburb, solidly middle class and upper middle class, with merchants, professionals who built and lived in the beautiful Victorians that were to become the subject of so much controversy and tragedy later. Now, the first of the neighborhood's great transformations took place as a result of the 1906 earthquake and fire, when poor, displaced working-class people from the burned-out south of Market and downtown areas poured in. And the single-family Victorians were divided into rooms and flats. The neighborhood became much more densely populated, poorer, and much more ethnically diverse. Large numbers of working-class Filipinos, Mexican Americans, and Jews moved in, and so did the two ethnic groups whose fates would become entwined in the neighborhood, African Americans and Japanese. Now, black people began arriving in San Francisco before the gold rush, but never in great numbers until World War II. In 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, just 4,846 blacks lived in the city, 2,144 of whom lived in the Western Addition. Most of San Francisco's Japanese lived there as well. In 1940, there were 5,087 Japanese living in the neighborhood. The willingness of the neighborhood's landlords, many of them Jewish, to rent to Japanese did not sit well with many whites. In 1907, the Chronicle ran a scare piece about the Japanese invasion of the Western Addition titled, "A Greater San Francisco or a Lesser Nagasaki? Which?" The Western Addition was one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. It was known as San Francisco's Little United Nations. The author, Jerry Flamm, has left a wonderful book about it. But that was all about to change on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And 2 months later, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, expelling all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The forced removal and imprisonment of 110,000 people, most of them American citizens for no reason other than their race, was one of the great injustices in U.S. history. But the sudden departure of 5,000 Japanese from the Western Addition proved a boon to another victimized group of Americans, blacks. The war brought an unprecedented flood of black immigration to San Francisco. By the end of the war, 32,000 black people, drawn by good-paying shipyard jobs and escaping grinding poverty in Texas and Louisiana and other states, had poured into the city. The jobs were there, but there was literally nowhere for the newcomers to live. Some found housing in the apartments that were quickly constructed in Hunters Point, but thousands more units were needed. And despite its proudly cosmopolitan tradition, San Francisco was no more racially enlightened than any other American city, and many white landlords refused to rent to blacks. In this charged situation, the empty apartment buildings and houses in Japantown were a godsend because the neighborhood was already racially mixed. Its landlords were happy to rent to black people. Between 1940 and 1950, the black population of the Western Addition went from 2,144 to 14,888. Citywide, the demographic change was even more startling. San Francisco went from having 4,846 black residents in 1940 to 43,502 in 1950. This was one of the stranger urban transformations in American history. The Western Addition went from being a Japanese neighborhood to a black one virtually overnight. This is eloquently described by Maya Angelou in her famous book. The old neighborhood was gone, and overnight its new inhabitants made it their own. The neighborhood they created before the city destroyed it was called the Fillmore, aka the Harlem of the West. Within months, the Fillmore was the center of black life in San Francisco. Its crown jewel was its jazz clubs. For more than 15 years, the Fillmore was the hottest jazz, blues, and R&B scene outside New York. The mile-long stretch of Fillmore and its side streets was packed with more than 24 clubs. The Western Addition did have serious problems. It had crime and drugs and high unemployment, much of it because whites wouldn't hire blacks, and a lot of its buildings were decrepit and overcrowded. But for all of its faults, it was a living neighborhood until the city decided to fix it. The destruction of the Western Addition was the result of a perfect storm of good intentions, unconscious racism, naivete, greed, and technocratic optimism. In particular, the belief that what was good for the city's business and general prosperity was good for its residents. It was San Francisco's cardinal sin, and the city is still living with its legacy. Most accounts of the Western Addition debacle emphasize the high-level planning decisions made after the war, but the city had its eye on Japantown long before the war ended. The residents of Japantown had not even been shipped off to Tanforan when city officials began worrying about what to do with their rundown neighborhood. An April 16, 1942 Chronicle editorial headlined, "Quick Action on Rehab of Jap Houses," read, "Departure of the Japanese from San Francisco presents an opportunity that will not come again to lift the face of a dreary section of the city, and at the same time creates a danger of the kind we are so prone to neglect until now. A blight now, the 20 blocks of Little Tokyo will become an outright slum if left alone. What to do? That's the rub. The problem was that Japanese owned much of the property." In 1943, the flood of black shipyard workers into Japantown and the extreme overcrowding of the neighborhood led a city commission to issue an alarming report about conditions there. The Chronicle reported, all participating in the effort to find a solution emphasized that it is not a racial problem, but a social and health hazard that would be the same if the district were overcrowded with whites. City officials appear to have believed that they were simply taking urgent action to clean up a blighted and unhealthy area. And it's worth noting, as William Issel points out, who is here tonight, the distinguished San Francisco historian, that in 1948, when the city designated the Western Addition for redevelopment, the area was still almost two-thirds white. However, there was cultural and racial topspin behind the decision. The fact that the slum area had been first a Japanese and then a black neighborhood clearly led officials to view Japantown and then black San Francisco, the Fillmore, as a kind of urban cancer that needed to be cut out. And the federal government played a crucial role in the nationwide campaign to remake inner cities. The 1949 Housing Act allocated $1.5 billion for urban renewal, defined as redevelopment of blighted areas. The federal government would pay two-thirds of the cost of renewing such areas. Cities large and small all across the country signed up for what would become known as urban renewal. On June 3rd, 1948, despite resistance from black and Japanese American residents, the Board of Supervisors declared the Western Addition a blighted area, one of 7 in San Francisco, and designated it for redevelopment. In 1959, the city acquired the properties in the area by eminent domain and began bulldozing them. In 1960, Geary Boulevard was demolished and work began on the enormous Geary Expressway. This third great transformation of the Western Addition turned out to be the most catastrophic of all of them. Redevelopment was supposed to be a win-win-win. Corporations and real estate interests would grow, the city would increase its tax base and clean up blighted areas, and the neighborhood's residents would be compensated for their losses and relocated in better housing. Now, what's crucial is if the third part did not happen, the whole endeavor would be a failure. As Herman himself, Justin Herman, who was the politically connected, dynamic leader of the redevelopment agency, who finally got redevelopment going after 10 years of inaction. As Herman himself wrote, without adequate housing for the poor, critics will rightly condemn urban renewal as a land grab for the rich and a heartless push-out for the poor and non-whites. Herman's words turned out to be prophetic. There was no adequate housing for the poor because the planning for it was fatally flawed from the beginning. There were 5 critical mistakes. First, the destruction of housing units was not phased. Thousands of units were demolished and new housing was not built for years. As a result, by the time housing was available, the community had scattered. Second, the redevelopment plans relied on invalid, overly optimistic predictions of turnover and vacancy. Third, the income of the displaced people was overstated. Fourth, the planning ignored segregation and racial covenants. Fifth, it relied on SROs as replacement housing, but no one wanted to live in SROs. Facing the destruction of their community, the residents of the Western Addition organized. In 1967, a coalition of progressive ministers and community leaders, including black leaders like Hannibal Williams and Japanese American ones like Yori Wada, formed the Western Addition Community Organization, WACO, to try to save their neighborhood. They picketed the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, organized and blocked bulldozers. WACO won some legal battles, managed to delay redevelopment, and got additional housing built, but it was too late. The battle was lost. By the time the bulldozers fell silent, 883 businesses had been closed, 20,000 to 30,000 residents displaced, and 2,500 Victorian houses demolished. Most of the displaced people left the neighborhood for good. The old racially mixed neighborhood around Japantown was trashed. The Geary Expressway, designed in part to carry commuters to department stores on Masonic, was not only an ugly gash, it became a Berlin Wall separating blacks and Japanese Americans. The corporate Japan Center gutted Japantown. With the exception of old people, few Japanese Americans live in Japantown today. But what happened to Fillmore Street was worse. The heart and soul of Black San Francisco was torn out. The loss only exacerbated a crisis fueled by unemployment. The demise of the shipyards and the disappearance of construction jobs forced blacks to look for work in service and tourism, where all too often they faced discrimination. It's the same old loaded dice for a Negro in San Francisco, said a Fillmore resident. They just sugar them up a little. As for the big housing projects built in the 1960s, they proved to be far more efficient petri dishes for growing crime and social pathologies than the crumbling old Victorians they replaced. And the Western Addition's main drag, Fillmore, has still not recovered. Unfortunately, San Francisco's experience was not unique. Cities across the country embraced urban renewal, usually with the same bleak results. So that was a rather long-winded response to your innocuous question.
But very good and very well detailed. Maddie and Noah, after hearing that, and I'd like to hear your personal thoughts and reflections because you're living in this, your families are living through this, and I'm wondering if there's some point where you're looking around at your neighborhood, your homes, your friends and businesses, and thinking, what the hell is going on here?
Well, for me, it was called urban renewal, but the real definition is
Negro removal.
urban. That's right. That's right. It was really heart-wrenching to see as my family migrated from the South, from Jim Crow, from New Orleans, and, my dad came out here for better opportunities and education.
And
for
how many
us.
how many members in your family?
It was 8 of us, and not only just us. My dad, but my aunts all came with their children. Everybody came. We, I think, within 2 years, my mom and all her sisters were here, and all my cousins. Yep. So we came from New Orleans because we had to escape, the racism that was going on down there during the 60s. It was not pleasant at all to watch or to have experienced that. And coming to San Francisco, as I was sharing with Noah, my geography book exploded because I lived in a neighborhood that was ethnically diverse and very welcoming, filled with businesses and opportunities, going to churches and schools that were fit for, me becoming who I am today. But to watch later, urban renewal, as they called it, was urban removal. And that's my definition. It was urban removal, and it's still disheartening today.
I can imagine. And Noah, you have a similar situation because your family also was right there in the heart of the
came out
Fillmore.
here in November of 1944. My parents were both educators in Florida. They were paying black teachers 47% of what they were paying white teachers by law. And my father had taught Thurgood Marshall, and they said, let's throw the case out of state court and try it in the federal district court under the 14th Amendment. And it took them 6 years, but they finally won. But my parents were barred from teaching in Florida as a result of that. So Roy Wilkins, who was then executive director of the NAACP, said, how would you like a job establishing 11 regional states of the NAACP out of San Francisco? And so he came here Thanksgiving 1944. I was born a couple of years later. He bought a fourplex, 1119 Webster Street between Turk and Eddy. And I can remember him walking me to Golden Gate Elementary School across the street when I was 4 years old. It was my job to just walk there every day thereafter. But the education in that district was not all that great, so we moved out to the Richmond district in 1952, I believe it was. And so I went to Lafayette, Presidio, and Washington high schools. And it was just a wonderful experience because there were Jewish kids, there were Chinese kids, Japanese kids, Greek kids, Russian kids, and it was just a conglomerate. And we lived a half a block away from Golden Gate Park, 8 blocks away from Playland at the beach. It was a wonderful experience growing up there.
Did both of your families, more or less, see the handwriting on the wall? Did you say to yourselves, your families, your parents, at some point, we got to get out of here before they're going to tear the building down and throw us out with the building?
Yeah, to watch houses, you know, they told us during that time with redevelopment, oh, you're going to get a certificate of preference, so you can come back, you can return. And thank God for the churches like Bethel AME Church, Third Baptist, First AME Zion, all those churches and those pastors came together to form a coalition. As you said, Reverend Hannibal Williams, they formed a coalition and educated us on what was taking place and how to strategize to go down to City Hall to protest. And that's what we did with the NAACP and other organizations supporting us. And to watch your neighborhood, as you said, 800 businesses on Fillmore Street, you know, I was just sharing with Noah, skating rink, movie theater. We didn't have to go downtown for anything. I bought my Easter clothes my mom purchased our clothes on Fillmore and Gary. We got our haircuts at Chicago Barbershop, my brothers did. We got our hair done at Esther's, Miss Esther's, you know, and Honorado's, the seafood market. Yeah. You know, we shopped there. Everything was there. It was a whole wonderful cultural environment, you know, and to see it destroyed like it was in front of our faces, and then to be lied to say that the houses were dilapidated. If they were dilapidated, then why are you picking them up on trailers and moving them to another city or moving them to Pacific Heights if they're dilapidated, if they're not fit for living?
We never looked at it as
No,
a
very
slum.
quickly, because I want to ask a question or
Sure.
two of Ernest here. But give me go ahead, Noah, but your same question that he just
We looked
asked.
at it was a ghetto, but we didn't look at it as a slum. It was a vibrant community. People enjoyed one another. There were musical outlets. There were restaurants. I never looked at it. We owned a fourplex there for some 50 years. I saw the changes coming about, and it was unfortunate that people were lied to. I'm sorry.
Ernest, your family, your father, had a very unique perspective on this and started documenting it at the very beginning, probably a little bit before the actual process began.
Yes, well, he began in around the end of 1959 into 1960. Oh, okay, this. His initial thinking was to document the loss of the beautiful architecture. He was an architect. He was working during the day, earning his architecture degree, and so he had my mother doing photographs during the work days, and he would come at lunch and on the weekends. But that's how they ended up both producing the photographs. They had 2 Rolleiflex cameras they went to shoot. So for my family, this starts as art. It's the appreciation of the beauty of the buildings that was being lost. But then, for me, that extended to thinking about the people. and their loss of beauty, people who lived there. So I know my father was very focused on architecture because he was an architect. But when I got the photographs when he passed away, and I began going through them, I was coming into this from art. But then I started finding out about whose houses those were, and why were they being torn down, and what happened to those people. And so art was really what brought me into this. And then I discovered the facts about urban renewal, and that's what made me bring it forward. Initially, it was just I was going to bring it forward in the art world.
And again, we're talking not about black and white prints that we see in a lot of family albums that dated back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You're looking at the raw film, the negatives, correct?
Yes. Well, the culture of my family is art, and so I was familiar with photography. My father had taught me about it. I had done darkroom work that he taught me about. But what I found was a box of 4,000 negatives. He had done some contact sheets, but the work had meant to be his first book called Facade. But he didn't end up doing the book. His first book was about the Palace of Fine Arts being torn down and rebuilt. So the project never went forward, but he kept them. So I got them and started working with them. But initially I had to catalog them and figure out what they were. It was a discovery process. And I think it's probably very much like a lot of you in coming into this story of urban renewal. You don't know a lot of things about it. And you find out something, and that leads you to something else. And that's what I went through. And I realized that this material really needed to be seen because there was nothing else like it talking about that. So I found out about Freedom West. I reached out to Landon Taylor, who is heading the redevelopment, and she brought me in, met Maddie. So it's a wonderful community, and what they're doing in redeveloping, it seemed to me to be all the things you would want it to be. So it was bringing the things that we learned from what happened in 1960 to 1970, and then looking at it now, how can we do this better? But the first thing is understanding what happened then. And you can't do better if you don't know what happened. So that's why I wanted to bring the photos forward, and why I wanted the voices of the elders to accompany it. Art is better with a story.
Yeah, and Gary, you look back at this period of time, and you think, we saw so many similar episodes, whether it was the Grapes of Wrath, the Japanese Americans who were placed into camps in the lead up in the aftermath of World War II. You would think we can't do this again, but here we were with our city leaders, our thinkers, the people who are supposed to be looking out for our best interests and the best interests of the city. But they're about to engage in a removal, a renovation, if you will, of a huge section of the town, which is really going to upend everything and the lives of hundreds and thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really, I don't think it's fair to compare the mindset of the city leaders who made terrible mistakes, and I think there was unconscious racism, maybe sometimes explicit racism. I think my assessment of what drove redevelopment was, as I said in that, what I just read, there was a kind of a technocratic optimism, there was a naivete, there was a belief, this kind of vital center pro-growth liberalism that Professor Issel talks very well about, that was sort of a very dominant force in San Francisco, and indeed in much of the country. So that in Culver City, I speculate, I have no idea if this is true, that the mania for urban renewal that swept the United States, kind of like the mania for freeways after World War II, might have been related to our literally blowing up and razing the cities of the Japanese and the Germans, and then rebuilding them with the Marshall Plan in the case of Europe, and having this kind of all omnipotent sense that we are in control, This was the heyday, the highest and tragically the biggest debacle of city planning. This was city planning at its most powerful. And they simply, and to some degree, one has to say that they also didn't benefit from knowledge of sociology and culture that they painfully gained. And during this episode, they were much too optimistic about the prospects of rehousing the people. But where their original sin really was, and this is where there is a kind of a genteel racism, if you will, that they didn't really plan. And even Mel Scott, this very liberal guy that wrote one of the most important early reports, said, well, we must make future plans for the resettlement of these people, meaning black people. And he explicitly defended black people at another place and said they've been badly treated and they've faced civil rights problems. So he was not a racist guy, but it sort of reveals the limits of 1948 style liberalism, that you sort of have these kind of pie in the sky, well-meaning beliefs about what's going to happen to the black people in San Francisco, but you don't actually take direct steps to house them. And then, it became an absolute horror show in terms of the demographic, of the impact on black people in San Francisco. So I think it's a complicated set of motivations. I wouldn't say that it's like rounding up Japanese and putting them in camps or even the Dust Bowl. It was more of a kind of we can do anything. We're men with lab coats.
The early days are the best and the brightest.
In a way, right?
No,
I think there was a political miscalculation as well. There was going to be a whole redevelopment of the Fillmore area in the early 70s. And when Alioto ran against Feinstein, and some of the elders in the community thought they could get a better deal at the last minute from Feinstein than they could from Alioto. And they switched over to Feinstein. And they went back to Alioto and said, we're ready to work this deal. And that's when the famous quote came out, you don't cast losers' chits at winners' windows. And that's when the whole development of the Nihonmachi area came in. And the Western Addition was a blighted area with fences around it for some 20 years after that. So we had a hand in our own destruction in a way.
Well, did any of your, either Maddie or Noah, any of your friends and families, did you feel at that time, leading up to the point that you just described, Noah, that you had friends at City Hall, that there were people that could actually hear your calls and try to stop the steamroller that was about to head towards your neighborhood?
I think Alioto would have, had everybody been faithful, because he was very strong with the unions, and they were very tight, but it was just a very, very poor miscalculation on the part of folks that thought that they could switch over to Feinstein and go right back to Joe, and Joe would be, great, let's go.
Maddie?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Noah, because the union jobs and the equity that impacted our community played a role in that. And, it was like, switching between the two, not knowing, that Alioto would have been better. And then Feinstein had a great plan as well. I remember going to her office because they were going to, because they shut down the water in our neighborhood, in the complex where I lived at the time. And she was very supportive in helping us get the water back on. And not only that, she was more, she became more visible, if you will, at that time. And so I think that made a lot of difference in her being elected over Alioto.
Ernest, when you're looking for the narration that came along with the photographs that your family was developing at that time, did you see a political narrative developing that went along with many of those photographs that you had?
Oh, of course. 1960 was an election year. In the photographs, you will see, I'm not sure if any of the ones in the exhibit, if this is obvious or not, but out of the 4,000, there's many where you see political posters on destroyed buildings. Who's left to vote? You got rid of everybody. So clearly was political. Now, in the Argonaut, I wrote a piece on the certificate of preference, and I referenced a brochure that the city did, a booklet called The New City, 1947. And it describes how Western Addition would be turned into a inland suburb, basically. Lots of green space and housing in blocks. And it's illustrated with a picture with two white people, a man in a suit and a woman in a dress, and they're kind of looking out over this imagined greenscape. And they talk about how you're close to the city opera and all these things. It makes me wonder, even as there definitely were some good intentions, because there was also another booklet that they published where they did look at the issues of the community, and there was concern about the issues that have been discussed. But I wonder if they brought in the actual community.
We were kind of subcontractors of our own image, and people were telling you what's good for you rather than you're telling. When you got a voting mass of 30 to 40,000 folks, all of a sudden you had to pay attention to what they were saying. And I remember when Terry Francois was the first black supervisor, and Willie Brown was in his office, and he said, I knew Willie was going to be jealous of me, but I didn't think he'd use the phones in my own office to lobby against me. That's Willie.
Well, the political situation now goes back to the idea that this was a changing city in the 60s, but also leading through the mid-60s and then into the changes that we saw in the 70s. Despite that, I mean, it seems to me that in some ways the voice that came out of the Fillmore became stronger in a political sense, even though there was this great deal of destruction. Now, would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, that would be an accurate assessment because at that time the Black Panther Party played a major role in educating the community on what was taking place, the Nation of Islam, and the black churches was strong on the issues of what was taking place. And of course, it was all political set up. It was, like I said, instead of being urban renewal, was urban removal.
Right.
The whole thing was planned to remove us out of that neighborhood. And the best way to do that is to get you out your homes, get you out of your house, tell you that your property is not fit for living, it needs to be condemned, and then put, a lot of people weren't able to pay their taxes, a lot of people weren't able to get loans. We fought to try to get loans to fix up our properties, could never get a loan. So the churches set up credit unions. People went there to try to get money through the credit union, thank God, to try to fix up their place, and still didn't have time enough to do it because it was politically designed to destroy the Fillmore community and to move black people out of there. Because I live 2 blocks from City Hall and Freedom West, prime location. When that happened 40 years ago, was not a prime location. It was not. It's filled with a lot of different things of drugs and prostitution and different things. The freeway ran through it. Hadn't been torn down yet. So we had a lot of areas that was blighted, but we had a lot of progress and success in other areas, and we were making progress. And still, to no avail, they decided to destroy Fillmore.
Jerry, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, F.D. Haynes ran for supervisor.
That's right.
In the late 40s and got a substantial vote. I think Examiner at the time editorialized, have to find a new way of electing supervisor. A Negro almost won. Oh, yeah.
Gary, why does this story seem to just stick with us? Is San Francisco unique compared to the other cities that went through similar efforts of renewal and urban renewal? Or is San Francisco pretty much the same wherever we saw these efforts by the federal government to bring a new face to a given neighborhood?
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on all of the various specifics of urban renewal projects across the United States. And there were, one of the striking things about it is they were not only carried out in large and medium-sized cities, they were carried out in small cities. They were carried out in hundreds of places across the country. My sense, again, with the caveat that I'm not an expert, is that there's a lot of similarities between, I've studied a little bit about what happened in Los Angeles. There's a lot of similarities all in many cities where the area is deemed blighted. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy about whether the area actually was blighted, and we have eyewitnesses here who saying it wasn't as blighted as the authorities said it was. I think there is, in some cases, the blight was pretty severe, and the authorities decided, there was this famous line, nothing but a clean sweep. It was like this image of a broom. We're just going to sweep it all up. And that would happen in many, many cities. And it was kind of part of the Robert Moses thing in New York, too, where, you've got the white man with the slide rule in his pocket and the big idea. And, and some of that was worked. And some of the freeways were necessary and important, but often they were not. There was a freeway revolt in San Francisco that actually saved a lot of neighborhoods, including black neighborhoods in the Panhandle and in the Haight, from the freeways. But no, this was a national phenomenon where I think it was where a lot of black communities across the country in the inner cities were decimated by this. And, whether they were as decimated as the Western Addition in every case, I don't have the knowledge to say, but I know that there was a lot of displacement in many different places. And the planning, again, was overly optimistic and perhaps genteelly racist in the sense, there's a famous line where someone asked, may have been one of the editors, maybe Fleming of one of the black newspapers.
Tom Fleming, some reporter.
Somebody said, hey, how long are you folks going to stick around here? Because there was this kind of feeling among the white establishment, okay, you all came from Texarkana to work in the shipyards. When are you going to go? And I guess it was Fleming said, hey, you see that Golden Gate Bridge? We're going to be here as long as that is. And there was a little element of the white establishment where it wasn't like they were like, oh, we can't have that happen, but they were kind of not really ready or to think through exactly how to deal with the situation. And so they embarked on this big cleanup program, which, James Baldwin famously said urban renewal means Negro removal. Now, I think that's too simplistic to apply to the entire urban renewal movement. But there's an uncomfortable grain of truth in there as well. So I think it's complex, and I think in effect, in reality, the effect, whatever the intentions of the white power structures of cities were, that often the effect was Negro removal. That's just undeniable. So that's the tragedy, and that's why we keep worrying and going back to this. It's kind of, in a way, if you take away dispossession of the Californios and, of course, the unbelievable racism against Chinese and Japanese, this is San Francisco's founding sin, certainly in the very modern times. So I think there's a reason why we keep talking about it, why we're talking about it tonight.
The first kid I met when we moved out to the Richmond district was a kid named Ken Matsuoka. And we were playing gin rummy on the back of a huge pad, and it said Matsuoka Cleaners. I said, well, your father was a gardener and your mother's domestic. He said, well, we own this Cleaners. And my older brothers and sisters were born in an internment camp, which was taught nothing about. It's the first time I learned about that. So a lot of it just comes through interacting with other folks and listening and learning about their histories rather than what you see in a textbook. I think the first textbook that talked about the contribution of African Americans, women, Hispanics, and Asians in the country was Land of the Free, John Hope Franklin's textbook in 1965, and the Birch Society lobbied against it, but it was standard 8th grade textbook for 2 years, and they finally got it removed.
Maddie, what do you see now? I mean, you still live in the neighborhood.
I still live in the neighborhood. I raised my children. in Freedom West. Freedom West Housing Cooperative was developed and thought of by Reverend J. Oster Hall of Bethel AME Church and all of the members that lived in that community that owned homes before, whose homes were torn down, and they were given certificates of preference to come back. So what I see now is similar, the same thing, gentrification of the Fillmore community. On Fillmore Street, how many black businesses do you see there now? On Fillmore Street, how many barbers or restaurants and shops and all the things we experienced do you see now? You don't see hardly any. You can count them, you know. And so the Visadero Street was another popular place to be. All the jazz clubs, the barbecue places, the hair salons, and the businesses. I mean, we had our own pharmacy on Golden Gate and Fillmore. That family had been there for years, and that was our pharmacy. And no more. Dr. Carlton B. Goodlett, who owned and ran the Sunday Reporter, was a very strong advocate with this, with WAPAC and all of the things that took place in the Fillmore. He and all the other doctors in and around the Fillmore area.
But why did you stay?
I had to stay. I was not going to give up because we fought too hard and too long for the property where I live at. I raised my children there. I lost my youngest son to gun violence there. A lot of parents, a lot of families left because of the drugs and the guns and things that was dumped in our neighborhood, you know, and gang violence erupted. And so that was another technique, another method to get us out. You know, get everybody on drugs, give them guns so they can kill each other, and then they'll start moving. And that's exactly what happened. A lot of people left. I did not leave. I could not. I've come too far, and I've worked with too many pastors, Reverend Hall, from Reverend F.D. Haynes, to Dr. Amos Brown, to Hannibal Williams, and all of the pastors. And I'm just committed to make sure that we get the justice that we deserve for the Fillmore area, and we're doing that with Freedom West. Freedom West, we're rebuilding Freedom West right now with Freedom West 2.0 because this time we're at the table. This time we're the ones that have the plans of what we want for our community. It wasn't like that before. We didn't have a seat at the table. We had someone representing us. Not so this time. We're representing ourselves.
Yeah. Noah, you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, you have to take into account, I think Kevin Starr and I once had an argument about San Francisco's lost its civic will. You know, you used to be able to just go in a neighborhood and do what you want. I said, now you have to go to the neighborhood and find out if it's okay with the people who live there, Kevin. But, you know, I've tried to strike out in different ways. I ran for town council in Tiburon, where I now live. There are 35 black folks in the town. Never been an African-American on the, but went and won and tried to make some changes, and were absolutely able to make some changes. So you kind of brighten the corner where you are and get folks used to you.
Well, you know, we just ran, I think, our fourth or fifth year of the Charles Frockia Literary Awards. And this year it was about neighborhoods in San Francisco, and our winners were from the San Francisco high schools. And it was really interesting to read some of the stories from these 16, 17-year-old students who were writing about their neighborhoods and identifying with their neighborhoods in a way that I thought for a while had been lost in San Francisco. And I wonder, you know, is there a way, is that a good sign that perhaps a younger generation is coming along with a much stronger identity to their neighborhood?
The first thing a native San Franciscan asks you, where'd you go to high school? Yeah. They don't care where you went to college, because that sort of identifies you. And then the Irish Catholics or the Catholics, which parish does grow up into? So
it doesn't matter where you're located either. You can be in New York, Boston, or Louisiana.
Well, one wag said everything in San Francisco is misnamed. There's no one rich in the Richmond. There's no sun in the Sunset. There's no beach in North Beach, and only love in the hate. So figure.
And Matt, how about you very quickly now? Do you recognize this point that I think I saw in our student writings this year where there seems to be with the younger generation, the kids nowadays, writing about the neighborhoods that they live in and identifying with it and recognizing the value that the neighborhood has to them.
Yes, we had a group of young people come to Freedom West. As a matter of fact, there were students that were interested in what happened to the Fillmore community. They heard about it, but they, wanted more direct approach about it, and from the people who live there. So we invited them to come to our neighborhood, walked them around, and told them where various things were. Ella Hill Hutch, the African American Art and Culture Center, about Lefty Gordon, about Mary Rogers, and I forget his name, the longshoreman. I forget his name. They laid down in front of the bulldozers, both of them, to stop the bulldozing of our property. They laid down, those two people laid down, not Charlie Walker, but Leroy King. Leroy King and Mary Rogers laid down, and I watched them, and that was so impressive to me, for our elders, to watch our elders fight so hard for us, and to stop the bulldozers from tearing down our property. And so now those young people now are coming back. They're coming back to Freedom West to learn more about what took place, because they learning that the truth that was, the lie that was told, they're not getting the truth. So now they're coming to us for the real truth, and I feel very, very powerful and excited about that.
Because of the work of your father, Ernest, and your curation, is San Francisco unique in its ability to have this resource with the photographs that he collected? Or are the other urban areas that were struck in the 60s and 70s, is there an archive that is similar to yours and to ours?
Not that I know of. There have been better or worse documentation of urban renewal in other places. My father would quote that it was 636 cities and towns across the nation that took advantage of the federal money and did similar things to what San Francisco did. And more often than not, the communities that were declared blighted, which of course is step number one to get the federal money, you have to declare blight. So whether it's there or not, you declare it, there's the federal money. More often than not, it was black communities that were the ones targeted. Our neighbor across the street talks about scatter people. This is in Westchester County, north of New York City. Same thing happened in some of the towns there, and so the people were scattered. So that's what they called each other locally, scatter people. But these things weren't well documented. I'm not aware of any other archive. There was a section of New York City that also, not the Robert Moses stuff, but near Lincoln Center, that was lots of artists and musicians. That was somewhat documented.
Indian Village, I think she said.
No, it was maybe Carnegie something. Anyway, it's near Lincoln Center. So that is somewhat documented, but I'm not aware of any other archive. And frankly, what happened in San Francisco is iconic of what happened everywhere. Yes, it happened in lots of places, but you don't have to have the photographs of every single place to understand what it was. And in San Francisco, because of the uniqueness of the Fillmore, it was all the more impactful. Harlem of the West.
Right.
It was too important a community to suffer that result, and then nobody knew about it.
In Ernie's library, I found a book that talked about other sites of urban renewal.
I'll be ready to open up to Q&A here. Would that be okay? And Francis is actually going to be our first question. Hold on a second. I just want to point out that we're going to open up for question and answer now, and we'll be sure to remember that we're going to pass the microphone around to you so that before you ask your question, you have a microphone firmly in your hand.
In looking through the things that were left along with the photos, there were some books. And in one of the books, when I reviewed it for making notes, for bringing forward some writing about what we had, there was an archive I came across in Portland, Oregon, that was smaller. It was only 200 or 300 photos, not 4,000, but they were demolishing an area that was like terracotta buildings, beautiful, bigger industrial buildings. So it was slightly different, but that was of the same era in the same program where there is an archive of it in Oregon.
I might point out that that was Francis, who came out from the East Coast with Ernest and knows a
Yes.
little bit about this. It's not just a voice out of the blue.
Something that I wanted to add, which talks about the loss in Western Addition. So we've heard about how the different communities had occupied these homes. So these homes served many communities, many people. And that connected those communities to each other. So think of the kids in that neighborhood, the black kids, the Japanese children, the kids who were in these houses that dated back to the 1800s. They may not have dated back to the 1800s. Their family may have just come from the South, but that home has a history and a connection, and it's theirs.
Yeah.
They live there. It's their home.
Yeah, I
They can
talk.
take that away.
I talk about some of those stories in Cool Gray City of Love. There was a young Japanese American woman who was the proprietor of Jimbo's Bop City, the legendary after-hours jazz club, which was a building that was moved.
Became the Marcus bookstore.
Blocks, it became Marcus Bookstore. But this little Japanese girl remembered that Jimbo Edwards, the first Cadillac African-American car salesman in San Francisco who opened this after-hours club, used to walk her across the street to school, sort of the same thing you're talking about. There's a lot of people that shared memories like that. And as I said, when they put in the monstrous Geary Expressway, that is essentially sundered not only these two vital parts of the city, but it sundered these two communities, which, I mean, it's not like they were totally chummy, and it's a tricky thing because the Japanese and Japanese American people coming back after World War II, and the black people are living where they used to live, but they worked it out, and there's a lot of touching stories of good will between those two communities after the war, but then just the redevelopment made it almost physically impossible for them to really have the same kind of relationship that they'd had before.
Okay, let's get a few questions and comments from our audience here in the museum. And again, we're going to pass around a mic. Don't raise your hands up high because we don't want you getting in the way of the cameras, but we'll be sure to find a way to get you. No, I think we're going to use separate audience mics here for it. But again, please keep your questions short and to the point. And if you do have a personal memory or insight to your days in the Western Addition, feel free. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering about the role that the building trades and the unions may have contributed to the sort of this drive for renewal.
I'm pretty sure, and Bill Issel may know the answer to this question, that they were part of the political horse trading that went into the business community's support for this. Inevitably, with a procedure like this, you're going to get the buildings trades involved. Bill, can you confirm that?
There's a microphone right to your left, Bill.
Hi, everybody. This is Bill Issel, Professor Emeritus at San Francisco State.
One of our great historians, a tremendous historian.
Many-time director of the Urban History Association. Number one, San Francisco was distinctive. It wasn't unique in the process of urban redevelopment. Also, the process began well before the 1960s and 70s. It began in the Progressive era with women who were convinced that urban life required more nature. And one of the oldest areas that has survived the 1906 earthquake, from the standpoint of this good government group that did the first survey of the Western Addition, a lot of the old buildings needed to be removed in order to bring more nature into the city. Okay, that's a long story. You can consult my book about the long redevelopment. As for the building trades, speaking as a former member of Local 6, IPEW, and a longtime resident of the Fillmore in the 1940s until the middle 1950s, the building trades were almost 100% in favor of urban redevelopment, as was the San Francisco Labor Council. And earlier, conflict among labor unions in the city ended by the 1950s. And that was a conflict between the CIO unions and the AFL unions. The CIO unions were strongly in favor of a residence-centered urban redevelopment process, the sort of thing you referred to that's going on now. But the Cold War politics, as they played out in San Francisco, ended the legitimacy of the CIO leaders, who were allied with the left wing of the 1940s black civil rights movement in San Francisco. Reverend Haynes was blacklisted and red painted, and so were the leaders of the San Francisco CIO. By the mid-1950s, the left of the building trades and labor movement was out of the picture.
Let's get the microphone immediately to your left there. For
Hi,
this gentleman.
I was just curious, because you mentioned that the neighborhood had been run down. What percentage was ownership and what percentage was landlord was being rented? And if you know, what percentage were absentee landlords?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that there was most of the rentals, most of the blighted housing was rentals. What exact percentage it was, and whether they were absentee owners. I have discovered in research that, as I say, partly because of the history, the earlier history of the Western Addition, and partly because Jews were willing to rent to blacks. Some of the owners were Jewish. Whether they were absentee in exactly what that would mean, they weren't living in those buildings, I'm sure, and nor were most of the owners of the buildings in the Western Addition, which often were extremely overcrowded. I mean, that's documented by city surveys and by numerous investigative reports, including one headed by Robert Flippen, who was the widely respected head of the San Francisco NAACP. He was the head of the West Side Projects, which was open only to black people, the still standing projects at Bush and Baker. And he did a survey finding really bad conditions, and he wrote, we've got people going to the bathroom in the streets, and there's a certain type of landlord who knows that he can get away with renting like this. So, there were probably some there were predatory landlords or just landlords that were taking advantage of the fact there was so little regulation of rentals at that time that you could just pack people in. A little bit like what happens in Chinatown now. Actually, Chinatown is still very similar to that. And no one dreams of eradicating Chinatown. Chinatown is more blighted and more run down, probably in many ways, than the Western Addition ever was. You've got absolute violations of, cubic air, regulations. But it would be, the city learned its lesson, and actually Chinatown, and you could argue that this would have been the case with the Western Addition, is actually, although extremely poor, you could never replicate that housing situation if you came in and tried to make a clean sweep, as they did in the Western Addition, even though you got people paying, packed in, but they're paying $472 a month rent to live in with a whole bunch of other people. So it's not a very specific answer to your question, but there's mostly rentals. You don't have people owning. They own, but they're not living in these buildings, so they wouldn't be blighted like that.
Let me just add something to that.
Very quickly, Ernest, and then we'll go to this gentleman here.
Yeah, I have a
1 minute,
question
sir.
for Mr. Camilla.
Just 1 minute, please. We're going to go to Ernest first.
There was also a lot of redlining that was going on. So the owners, good faith, bad faith, any faith, couldn't get loans to fix up the properties even if they wanted to. And what if all that federal money, instead of tearing them down, had gone to fixing them up?
And I want to add to that because majority of the people that I went to school with lived in my neighborhood, and they own their own homes. They own those fourplexes. They had their businesses underneath. They may have had a storefront. They own their own. They own their own homes. And as he said, redlining took place. And as I said earlier, they couldn't get loans to fix up. They would put, give them. The city would put things on their home saying that you got to fix this up. This is not up to par, or you got to get this done or this done. And where were they going to get the money from to do that? So what happened? Your place becomes condemned, okay? And then we're going to have to, we're coming through to tear this down. And then you find out later that they told you they were going to tear it down, but you see the trailers moving in later on, years later, picking up, lifting up these Victorians and moving them elsewhere in the city. So it was a huge lie and a disappointment because a lot of people lost their homes and businesses.
Well, let's head over to this gentleman here, sir.
Mr. Camilla, you said in your summary of the history of the Western Addition that about 1948, I believe you said, the Board of Supervisors met and they discussed, in addition to the Fillmore, 7 or 8 other neighborhoods for redevelopment. Out of curiosity, what were those neighborhoods?
Let's see. Well, there was Diamond Heights was probably the most anomalous of them. That was a blighted area, and there's still public housing up on Diamond Heights. There was one along the Embarcadero. There was, if I can see your copy of the Argonaut. No, yeah, it's in
Right in the beginning there?
in the beginning.
I think it's
There's a
highlighted.
piece. Thank you. Yes. This is a piece. No, but not that. Different one. It's the piece by Mark Buell, which is, 424. Okay. He was involved. Yeah, so the 7 were the Embarcadero. So that was the Golden Gateway and the Embarcadero Center. That was the old produce market that was knocked down. Diamond Heights, Hunter's Point, where much of the public housing was knocked down. The Yerba Buena Center, which became one of the granddaddies of San Francisco's land use battles over the displacement of elderly, low-income residents, and who formed a group called TOUR, then fought long and hard against that. That was south of Market, I think was related to the Yerba Buena Center. I'm not quite sure whether those are separate. Kearny Street, the old Hall of Justice, which was torn down, and the Hilton Hotel now stands near where that was. And then there was the 2 areas, and we haven't gotten into the details of the Western Addition, but there was A1 and A2. A1 was the smaller first one, which was completely razed, and A2, much of it was as well, but I think there was more. By then, some of the resistance managed to preserve some of that. But those were the 7 San Francisco neighborhoods that were designated as blighted areas and give with federal funds for redevelopment.
Let me see. We're going to come back here for a question from the audience.
I couldn't hear that.
The question was, what degree did redlining, both for black people and Japanese Americans, prevent them from, maintaining ownership of their homes or improving them? I think you already spoke to this, but maybe you should take that.
Yes, they did redlining did really crippled the community even further. As you can, right now, even in this very time, redlining has already occurred through the Hayes Valley neighborhood. It has happened, and we have fought hard and long to stop it, and it continues to this very day with gentrification in the Fillmore Western Addition neighborhood. To this very day, it's still going on. It has not stopped.
Do we have any questions from this? I believe I saw a hand up over here. Anything over here? Yes, sir. Let's get a microphone to you, and this gentleman can ask the next question.
Could you, speak to your impressions of Justin Herman? His obviously was the director of redevelopment, but was he, one would think that he was the villain behind the movement, but I heard you refer earlier that maybe he wasn't. And I'm just curious as to if any of you knew him and what kind of guy he was and how much his will was responsible for what happened.
Well, I can take that. I certainly didn't know Mr. Herman, but all the historical sources, interviews, all the history books state unequivocally that Justin Herman was the mover and shaker who really got redevelopment going. Redevelopment was approved in 1948 by the Board of Supervisors, and then essentially it languished for 10 or 11 years until Justin Herman took over the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, and he was a really dynamic leader. He was politically connected. He made things happen. So he took the plans and the city's desire and the desire of the mayors and of the supervisors and of city of business interests, and he got things going. He was responsible for all of the political muscle to get the eminent domain and all of the things that made it possible to do this. This is my understanding that
he's not looked upon as a hero within the black community.
And he was, he had Justin Herman Plaza named after him by the equally now vilified Valencourt Fountain, and he then suffered the ignominy of now ex post facto being sort of written out of San Francisco history. And
looks like a rectangular garbage chute.
Right. I read that quote in the little intro that I did, where he did acknowledge himself that if what happened, the whole thing would be a failure. So, at least he had the honesty to admit that. And but beyond, I'm not an expert in Mr. Herman's that, but Professor Issel has something to say.
Very quickly, and then we're going to go to this young woman over here.
Hi.
Wait,
hold on.
Bill first.
Let's get a quick response from Professor Issel.
Very quickly, Justin Herman was a nationally eminent city planner. He worked for the Housing and Home Finance Agency, which was a predecessor to today's Housing and Urban Development. He was hired by George Christopher. I interviewed former Mayor Christopher. That was in the early 1990s. Christopher was still proud of having hired Justin Herman on the grounds that Justin Herman could administer urban redevelopment for the good of the entire city, as well as for the residents of particular neighborhoods that were part of the urban redevelopment areas.
Okay, ma'am, your question here?
I
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I'd like to share with you that if you're interested in a photo history of the Western Addition, the San Francisco Public Library History Center at the main library has a series of photo history projects of various neighborhoods, and we launched it in the Western Addition about 30 years ago. It's called Shades of the Western Addition, and our goal was to capture family photos from every community that resided in the Western Addition. So we have photos from Jewish American families, and then Japanese American families, and then African American families. And I'd like to share a very poignant memory. A Japanese American woman told me that brought photos of her family's music store on Fillmore Street, the building and the store. And she told me that her entire family was interned during the war and went to an internment camp. And after the war, they returned hoping to be able to reoccupy their building. And they were overjoyed because an African-American woman who was their neighbor had sequestered the keys to the building and chased off squatters and protected the building for them and turned the building back over to them. So it's a great photo history of the Western Addition. You'll see buildings that were destroyed because of the San Francisco urban redevelopment. And you'll see photos of community activities going back to the Jewish community and the Japanese American community going back to the 20s and 30s. So, and you can view some of the collection online at the SFPL website, but the entire collection is free to anybody to visit and look through at the History Center in the main.
Okay, thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question. Can we get a microphone out to our next question? Do we have a question for the floor? Seeing none. Final, I'm going to sort of exercise the pleasures of the chair here and thank everybody for coming here tonight. Ernest, Noel, Maddie, Gary, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And also thank everybody online. And a reminder that you can still get your copy of The Argonaut with these fabulous photos that come from Ernest and his family. And it's a great, great visual as well as some great narration. Thank you all for being here tonight. And now we're going to turn it back over to Todd.
Well, and I just want to say thank you very much for moderating tonight's panel. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. These were wonderful questions. This is incredibly important history. We are going to have our opening. We were there coming up, so I'd love to see you, welcome you back here to our exhibit and be able to hear from more voices around this important history and story. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you very much. And Gary's going to be here, by the way, signing his paws.